Hello Dark Case family, welcome home. First off, I got you, so don't worry. To skip my intro, just click the timestamp down below. Still here? I knew I could count on you. We are the forgotten, the forsaken, the former weird kids, the outcasts. And I know we've all been through something, so if nobody has told you this recently, everything is going to be okay. Today I have 4 stories for you, and this video runs for over an hour, so make sure you grab a drink, some snacks, or just get comfy the best that you can. I carefully curated each one of these true stories to give you that weird feeling. You know the one. It's the reason that you're watching this video, so make sure you stick around for all 4 true dark tales. Oh, and by the way, please do hit subscribe to help us keep in touch. Also, liking the video will make sure my other videos get recommended to you, and commenting will help the Dark Case family to grow even quicker. So why not introduce yourself down below and see if you can't make a new friend. Here at Case Documentaries, I bring you true crime, disturbing stories, and other things that you may later
regret. Narrate.
Westchester County, New York is situated just north of New York City. It has long been considered as a pretty safe and idyllic respite from the sprawl of the big city, and it prides itself on being a family town. However, the events that took place in Westchester County in the spring of 1984 to the spring of 1985 were so macabre that they inspired aspects of the Thomas Harris novel Silence of the Lambs. On July 16, 1984, a 12-year-old girl named Antonella Martina disappeared. Antonella was precocious and caring, so she offered to run some errands for her mother. Initially, her mother was reluctant, but her daughter insisted, claiming that she was a big girl now, and that she simply wanted to help out more. Finally, her mother gave in and sent Antonella to cash a check on her behalf. But when she realized that she'd been gone for over an hour, the mother started to panic. She called her husband and he came home early with their son Leo, and together the family went out looking for Antonella. After a couple of hours with no luck, they contacted the police. Eyewitnesses confirmed that Antonella had entered the bank, but no one had seen her after she left. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a full year before any light would finally be shed on the case. Close to a year later, on February 24, 1985, Officer Stymolowski conducted a traffic stop that would prove to be his last. The young officer was recently engaged to be married, and he was just 27 years old. At around 7 p.m, Gary pulled over a 1972 blue Mercury Capri. It had hand-painted Ghostbusters decals on the bumper. He pulled it for reckless driving. He then radioed for a tow truck to impound the car. This was because the driver did not have a license, nor did he have insurance. And then Stymolowski found shotguns and ammunition in the vehicle, so he called for backup. At the time, the driver had 3 associates in the car, 2 male and 1 female. They later reported that the driver claimed that Stymolowski was giving him a hard time and that he was gonna kill this cop. The associates claimed that they thought he was joking, but just a few moments later, the driver produced a handgun from under his seat and he pulled the trigger 3 times aimed at the officer. Gary Stymolowski lost the fight for his life. Just 2 days later, on February 26, 1985, Beverly Capone was reported missing. Beverly worked at IBM and drove a white Toyota that she had recently bought for herself. Her colleague recounted that when she was leaving the office that day, Beverly told her, "I'm taking these old bones right home." Beverly was of Irish descent and she was known for being feisty and assertive. This was despite her petite stature. She was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. While she and her husband were divorced, they still remained great friends, and Beverly was extremely close to her daughter Pamela too. Pamela, who was 22 at the time, had tried to get hold of her mother all day. She'd left messages on her machine, but by the time 9 p.m. rolled around, she had still heard nothing back. So now she knew that something was wrong. She called her father and initially he said she shouldn't worry. Maybe Beverly had just gone out with friends or she was maybe working late. But Pamela knew her mother and she felt unsettled. She had that feeling in her gut that we so often speak about. The daughter forced herself to put those bad thoughts aside for a little longer, but she then reported her mother missing the very next day. In the 2 days between Officer Stymolowski's murder and Beverly Capone's disappearance, a lot had transpired. But to really understand the timeline of events, we have to go back to the fateful night of the routine traffic stop. A man named Alex Mengel was driving the car that Officer Stymolowski pulled over for reckless driving. Mengel was a Guyanese immigrant who worked as a security guard, as well as a tool and die maker, and he spent a lot of time between the Bronx and Westchester, New York. Mengel and his 3 associates were heading back from a hunting trip in the Catskill Mountains when they were pulled over. Mengel, as we know, was agitated by the stop, and ultimately he was the one to pull the trigger. Before the murder, however, as he pulled out his handgun, he instructed his associates to drive his Mercury Capri, complete with Ghostbuster decals, over to the Bronx as soon as they heard the shot. Mengel's motive for the murder seemed kind of vague. It wasn't just because he was angry. In his mind, he had good reason. It was later revealed that Mengel had a criminal record, a record that would have almost certainly seen him be arrested by Stymolowski. Firstly, there was ammunition and shotguns in the truck. Secondly, Alex Mengel was an illegal immigrant. And finally, he was a perpetrator of domestic violence. Around a year prior, only a few months before Antonella's disappearance, on May the 2nd, 1994, a woman showed up at a Westchester County emergency room with a broken jaw. This woman was Mengel's wife. Initially, she told medical staff that she had been mugged, but eventually she broke down, finally revealing that her husband had been beating her for years. His wife was essentially Mengel's first confirmed victim. Because of this, he was arrested, but he did not go to jail. This specific crime was taken far less seriously at the time. Thankfully though, his wife is one of the first women in New York history to be put in a pilot program for survivors. Her last name was changed, she was housed in protection, and Mengel was never allowed to see her ever again. He was, however, allowed supervised contact with his son, but only in specified locations. But back to the traffic stop. As instructed after hearing the shot, the 3 associates drove Mengel's car to the Bronx. Mengel then stole the cop car with the wounded officer still in the front seat, and he headed in the opposite direction and then abandoned the car. Mengel lays Officer Stymolowski across the front seats, leaving him to bleed out, and then he stole his handgun before fleeing. However, he was unable to turn off the flashing police light on top of the car, and this failure captured the attention of another police officer. They eventually found the abandoned car, and sadly, Stymolowski's body. Meanwhile, the cops at Stymolowski called for backup arrived at the scene of the traffic stop, and with no Stymolowski, no police vehicle, and no Mercury Capri to be found, a search quickly followed. Around the Bronx, it was common knowledge that Mengel drove a car with hand-painted Ghostbuster decals on it, so officials soon had at least one suspect in the murder of Officer Stymolowski. I mean, you couldn't really make yourself much more obvious, could you? At this point, Mengel had run across the highway, and he was now hiding out in a shed at the Yonkers Motor Inn. This was confirmed when a young female shop worker later reported that Mengel had entered her convenience store. She was working the register for her parents, and said that a very sweaty and out-of-breath Mengel had come in. He purchased a soda and was carrying something wrapped up in a shirt or a towel. Simultaneously, Mengel's Mercury Capri was discovered abandoned in the Bronx. A local crime unit in the Bronx started off by surveilling the car. 3 hours passed by and no one approached the vehicle, so they changed tactics. They then decided to start searching the block that Mengel's car was found on. However, because this particular neighborhood is known for substance-related crimes, they had to wait for backup to arrive first. Authorities knocked on doors with emergency service units from NYC and canine units in tow. They took Mengel's car in to look for evidence and they questioned whoever they could. They eventually stumbled upon an acquaintance of the perpetrator. They revealed that Mengel had been up in the Catskill Mountains with a few friends. This was the 3 associates in the car, along with one other person who had driven back in his own car. Police found all of these friends and took them in for questioning. At first, the friends, later dubbed the Bronx Four by author David Paul, remained tight-lipped. But after a very intense interrogation, which saw one of the friends being held out of a window, they finally snapped and revealed that Mengel had, in fact, murdered Gary Stymolowski. On February the 29th, 1985, 3 days after Beverly Capone's disappearance, a young girl was approached by someone in a white Toyota. The girl was delivering newspapers on her paper route in a suburban neighborhood. That is when the woman in the car called her over, asking for directions. The girl got closer to the car and then noticed that the woman was actually a man. He was wearing an ill-fitting wig, along with women's clothing. The girl backed away when the driver pointed a handgun at her. He threatened to end her life if she didn't get in the car. Amazingly though, the girl managed to escape by running to a neighbor's driveway, and that neighbor then contacted the police. The police showed the young girl a series of photographs, and she immediately identified Alex Mengel as the person who had threatened her. The manhunt was now officially on. He must still be nearby. Police located a relative of Mengel's near where the incident with the young girl had taken place. This was close to Buffalo City. They discovered that Mengel was desperately trying to make his way up to Canada, and they now knew that he was driving a white Toyota. By this point, the news about Beverly Capone was all over the country. This included her photograph and the details of her car, which was also a white Toyota. Pretty quickly, police suspect that Mengel, the confirmed cop killer, was connected to the Beverly Capone case as well. They put out a wanted notification throughout the country and Canada for Alex Mengel. On March 2nd, 1985, a white Toyota was spotted driving in the suburbs of Toronto. It was the white Toyota with Beverly's license plate still intact. Driving the car was Alex Mengel. He was now finally under arrest, but the vile details of his crimes were still to be discovered. In the car, they found that Beverly's driver's license had been altered, and then they discovered what was believed to be the wig. Until further inspection, the hair was actually attached to skin. It was the scalp of Beverly Capone. And almost unbelievably, this wasn't the worst thing they found in that car. Also laying in the vehicle was Beverly Capone's face. Mengel had been trying to use it as a disguise along with the altered license and her hair. Beverly's body was eventually found 11 days after her disappearance on March 4th, 1985. The remains were found near Mengel's cabin in the Catskill Mountains. Her time on this earth was ended after a sharp implement pierced her heart. Biological evidence matched the remains found in the white Toyota on the day that Mengel was arrested. Mengel's car, the DIY Ghostbuster Mercury Capri, was also examined for evidence. Hidden inside the ashtray by the dashboard, police found several photographs of young women, as well as a map that had particular locations circled. These images comprised of 4 wallet-sized photographs and 1 Polaroid. Unfortunately, even though they were compared to missing cases and homicide incidents, no identifications of these women have ever been made to date. Still, police suspect these photographs indicate either victims or potential victims of Mengel. After being arrested on March 26, 1985, Canadian authorities ordered Mengel's deportation back to New York City. There he would be charged and tried for the murder of Beverly Capone and Gary Stymolowski. En route back to the United States, Mengel tried to escape his fate once more. He attacked his police escort and attempted to grab his sidearm. A struggle ensued which would result in the death of one person in the vehicle. The officer driving the car quickly pulled over and leapt into action. He attempted valiantly to save the life of his partner in a moment of panic and heroism. The struggle continued, and one shot rang out. One of the men was hit in the chest. Their time on this earth ended almost instantly. That man was Alex Mengel. 2 years later, on Thanksgiving Day 1987, remains were found in a shallow grave in Yorktown, New York. The remains belonged to Antonella Martina. She had vanished a year before Beverly Capone whilst running the errand for her mother. Her cause of death was ruled as multiple sharp implement wounds to the chest. Given the nature of Mengel's previous crimes, authorities suspect he was behind Antonella's murder as well. Police would make a horrifying statement, one that perhaps gives more weight to the actions of the officer that pulled the trigger defending his colleague in the police car. They believed that if he were not arrested when he was, Mengel displayed all the makings of a serial killer, and the police officer may have put an end to what could have been one of the worst reigns of terror ever seen in the United States. Sally Honeycheck and her sister Lorraine had spent all their lives in Detroit. At 80 years old, Sally had seen the neighborhood they lived in, Poletown, keep evolving over the years. Poletown is on the east side of the city, and as is pretty obvious once you find out, it's named after the Polish residents who initially started a community there in the early 19th century. The two sisters lived in the same house that they grew up in, the one their parents had bought in 1951, right before Sally was born. Sally and Lorraine, although they had no partners, did have a dog named Jack, so the three of them kept each other company, kept each other safe. The house had 6 stained glass windows, through which the Honeycheck family saw history unfold on their street, and so Sally and Lorraine stayed in the house as the seasons of life kept bringing change. They saw the car industry that Detroit was famous for moving slowly away from the center, taking with it jobs and communities. Behind were left empty shopfronts and increasing poverty. From 1950 to 1960, roughly 20% of Detroit's population was lost. Police brutality and profiling amongst the city's minority residents was also endemic. Social unrest was growing. Even though it was now a century after emancipation, and slow shifts were happening from the civil rights movements in the 1950s and 1960s, many citizens still weren't being given equal rights. Sally was 30 years old when the Detroit riots started in the hot summer of 1967. It was a response to the ever-increasing tension caused by a city moving closer and closer because of discrimination and institutionalized maltreatment of certain people. The riot began on 12th Street, where an unlicensed after-hours club was raided by the police in the early hours of Sunday morning. A party was being held there for veterans. This included 2 minority soldiers who had recently returned from the Vietnam War. People were understandably reluctant to move the celebrations into the sticky streets, after spending the preceding hours enjoying the cool of the air conditioning inside. However, the orders were made by the police. This caused protests and police blockades. The situation quickly and dramatically escalated over the next 5 days. The Michigan National Guard and US Army, as well as state police, were called in to quell what became one of the biggest civil uprisings in 20th century America. 43 people lost their lives and hundreds more were injured. Sally saw how the riot became a slow turning point for the city. Activism grew in response to police violence. She would have seen her community and the nation changing around her. In 1974, the first person of color was elected as mayor to run the city, serving until 1994. And as Sally grew older under the mayor's leadership, She continued to stay in her own small community and in her childhood home. She attended church weekly and enjoyed seeing familiar faces in the congregation, and they enjoyed seeing her. In her middle age, Sally would become engaged to a man named Dennis, but it wasn't to be. Her partner moved to New York and the relationship broke down, and Sally never married. She worked all of her life as an insurance adjuster, finally retiring in 2009. As a person, she loved putting together different outfits, her interest in fashion helping her pick between clothes that she collected over the years, amounting to a huge collection. Even when Sally simply went out to pick up groceries, people would notice how her earrings matched her necklace, how her hair was styled perfectly in place, and how her eyebrows were dyed to match her hair. The way Sally appeared in public was so meticulous that no one thought anything other than this must be exactly how she was at home too. Clean, organised and beautifully presented. The outside of her house that she shared with her sister, for those that passed by, was also pretty neat too. The lawn was mowed and the flowers in the front garden clipped. It looked like an almost picture-perfect home. People walking past, people in the neighbourhood, people in Sally's life, often thought how much they'd like to see inside the home. It was assumed by different people that the owner must invite friends and family over regularly, but the reality was very different. After Sally and Lorraine's parents passed and they took on the house together, no one was ever invited in to come and visit. Not for birthdays, not for Christmas, not for Thanksgiving, not even as social gatherings to watch games where the Tigers were playing, Sally's favourite team. The sister's cousin Linda saw her monthly, mostly at church dinners. Sally continued to turn up reliably, with her cousin always commenting on her outfit, or how her nails had been recently done. Linda could never have guessed what was happening, hidden behind the always freshly painted and well-kept front door, that how Sally appeared in public was so different to how she was inside. It may have taken much longer for Sally's cousin to find out something else was going on. That is, if Sally had called her on Thanksgiving in 2019. Sally usually reliably called over the holidays, so slightly concerned, Linda tried calling her, but there was no answer. Panicked, she contacted the police to ask them to do a welfare check at the house. Linda also phoned around the local hospitals to see if something may have happened, and that is when she found that a honey check was in hospital after a stroke. But it wasn't Sally, it was her sister Lorraine. The police visited the house as Linda requested. When they knocked on the door, there was still no answer. And even when they tried again later that day, still nothing. Linda met the police at the house and begged them to knock down the door, hoping to check that Sally was okay. She can only imagine how quiet and lonely it must have been not having her sister at home with her. She now worried deeply for her beloved cousin. The police said there wasn't enough evidence to warrant a break-in to the house. No shots or screams had been heard from inside the home, and no one's life appeared to be in danger. There was really nothing to suggest that something was wrong, but Linda, understandably, was still very worried. She had that gut feeling that is impossible to ignore. When Linda visited Lorraine in hospital just 2 days later, she found out that in fact both sisters had been taken into the facility. Although Sally had been the one to call 911, when the ambulance came for Lorraine, the crew saw the inside of the house, how the sisters had been living, and they called a second ambulance for Sally. Linda wondered why Sally would need to be taken to hospital, simply because paramedics had seen the inside of the house. Surely the inside of the house was neatly kept and maintained, just like the outside, just like Sally. Where is Sally now then? Linda asked the staff, and they told her she'd checked out on November the 12th so she could feed her dog. So now over 2 weeks had passed and nobody had heard from Sally. On the 29th of November, a few days after Thanksgiving weekend, Linda was almost at breaking point with worry. The police would not register Sally as missing, and so Linda told the police, "I'm breaking in instead." Accompanied by a friend who was an ex-police officer, Linda headed to the house on December the 1st. Giving it one more try, Linda knocked again on the door, but like all the other times, she got no answer. So instead, she went to the back of the home. There was an outside door to a cellar, but it was padlocked shut. Using bolt cutters, Linda prized it open wide enough to climb inside. Nothing could have prepared her for the smell that struck her nostrils. It was almost like trash that had been left out too long in the street in the sweltering summer heat. Upon entering, she also struggled to open the door fully. It was being blocked by something behind it. Linda tentatively stepped in. "Sally," she called. No answer. The smell was even stronger now she was deeper inside the home. She started gagging, pulling her sweater up to cover her mouth. The house was strangely dark. All around her were boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. She wondered what could be in them. Now moving up the stairs from the basement, she first reached the kitchen. There was waste and trash 12 inches deep, and the cupboards were stuffed so full that the doors had burst open. The counters were piled high with what looked like old takeaway boxes, collections of tickets, receipts and leaflets. The bed was too full of stuff to be slept in, and there was nowhere to sit, not even on the sofa or the chairs in the living room, because the clutter was piled high on them too. No one had seen, nor could they have guessed the extent of how bad things had become. The smell in the kitchen, however, was the worst so far in the house, although that would probably make sense, rotting food everywhere. Linda was shocked. She could barely breathe, stifled by the thick air. As she turned to look around the room for signs of where Sally was, Linda jumped at what she thought she saw. A human skeleton. However, she convinced herself that this was just a Halloween decoration. The skeleton was slumped over the kitchen table with a red sweater pulled over it. Linda wondered what kind of sick person would break into Sally's house to play this prank. It was bizarre, confusing, and most of all, concerning. She wondered too how Sally and her sister had been living like this, trapped in this life for years and years, surrounded by filth and mess. None of this made any sense. Linda crept out of the room to explore the rest of the house. She struggled to believe exactly what she was seeing. She could hardly walk through the home because of how deep the clutter was. Every door she opened to every room was the same. Linda could see small pathways that Sally and her sister must have created over time, so that they could still move around the house to some degree. But these were tiny and narrow, and on either side were layers and layers of things that Linda couldn't even begin to properly identify. As she walked through the home, she could hear the scurrying of tiny feet, and she felt queasy. The place was infested with rats, but she still had no answer to her question. Where was Sally? Linda called her name louder and louder with no answer still. Defeated, she went back outside, just as the police were arriving. "Have you found her?" they asked. Linda answered, "No." But there was that Halloween prank that someone had played in the kitchen. That was surely worth mentioning to authorities. It seemed like someone could have broken in and done this, and that needed investigating. She told the police what she'd seen, and so together they made their way back into the kitchen, back to the skeleton at the table. Keeping her sweater pulled up over her mouth, Linda edged closer to the table. The skeleton was sitting in a blue lawn chair, the colour of which though had faded because of all the dirt and debris that covered it, and what the police said next was almost unbelievable. "This is her, Linda," the police whispered. "The dog has been eating her." Linda's vision started to blur. The police held her up on either side so that they could remove her from the situation. The cold December air felt so fresh compared to the dense atmosphere inside the house. Linda tried to process what she'd just seen. She felt too shocked to even cry. The doting cousin tried to make sense of how the sisters had lived in such squalor and how they ended up like this. She read about how hoarding is a disorder. Some people can't let go of possessions, and this eventually interferes with their ability to live normally. She saw with her own eyes how this could happen in the once loved home. Linda felt overwhelmed. As well as having to make sure that Sally's sister was safe, she now needed to sort through the house to take care of Sally's affairs. So, week after week, she turned up at the house to sift through the rubbish with a friend. For their own safety, they both had to wear hazmat suits. They could only safely be in the house for 20 minutes at a time. That is how hazardous the house had become. Together, the two friends tried to go through decades of debris and hoarding. It was almost impossible to find the things that they needed. The valuables, the keepsakes, the insurance forms and money. Everything was mixed together with the trash that packed the home. The confusing mass was made of empty pizza boxes, unopened Avon items and receipts, and everything was covered in rat feces. Linda found old pictures of the house from before, when it was still a normal family home, and then as a stark reminder of what she had witnessed, the post-mortem results came back. It confirmed what Linda already knew, what she had witnessed with her own eyes. There had been extensive post-mortem animal consumption of Sally. This was by Jack the dog, as well as rats. Reading this, Linda was finally able to cry. She realised just how ill Sally had been, how much her mental health had deteriorated. Linda and her friend finally cleared the house and restored it to how it was originally. The insidious smell that had seemed to soak into even the very walls of the property finally dissipated following deep clean after deep clean. On the day the house went up for sale, Linda looked through one of the stained glass windows, the very same that Sally and her sister had looked through, as Detroit's history unfolded in front of them. She saw lilacs growing in the bushes outside. Carefully, she went out to cut a handful. She took them back into the kitchen, a space which now looked like a different room from when she'd first discovered Sally's body in there. She pulled a vase from the cupboards, now otherwise empty. They were freshly painted and able to close, unlike before. And then she set the fresh flowers down on a table, a sign of life and a fresh start from the horrors that had been witnessed inside the house. Deepwater divers are the madcaps of the diving community. They are the ones that explore the dark labyrinths of underwater caves and the depths of the oceans. Essentially, claustrophobia incarnate. One such daredevil was a man named Dave Shaw, an Australian scuba diver, technical diver, and an airline pilot. Shaw's story is one of bravery, mystery, and one that ultimately ends in the worst possible way. Dave Shaw was born on July 20th, 1954, and his life was adventurous and exciting. Before joining the airline Cathay Pacific, Shaw flew for Mission Aviation Fellowship in Papua New Guinea and Tanzania, and he piloted agricultural aircraft in South Australia and New South Wales. However, it was his passion for diving that led him to the most extreme and dangerous places on Earth, descending with deep dive gas mixes at extreme pressures. Shaw knew very well the risks involved. At such depths, oxygen can become, in a way, toxic, and nitrogen can cause narcosis, a state that divers describe as being similar to drinking several martinis on an empty stomach. Shaken, not stirred, obviously. Helium isn't any safer as it may also cause nervous fits, and if a diver ascends too quickly, the gases forced into their tissues under pressure can form bubbles, causing a condition known as the bends. This can lead to severe pain, paralysis, or even death, obviously extremely dangerous in deep bodies of water. To minimize these risks, divers must spend hours ascending slowly, allowing their bodies to decompress safely. There's even a saying among the divers, if you do the depth, you do the time. One of the most exciting yet dangerous dive sites is Bushman's Hole. It is located on a Mount Carmel game farm in South Africa. This vast crater, surrounded by veld and termite mounds, is hidden from view until you reach the rim. The crater's entrance is narrow and claustrophobic. It leads to a vast, dark chamber, which creates an otherworldly experience, as if you're spacewalking. Dion Dreyer had already logged about 200 dives, when he was invited to join some South Africa Cave Diving Association divers at Bushman's Hole over the 1994 Christmas break. They planned a descent to 492 feet and asked Dion to dive support. He was absolutely thrilled. For young cave divers like Dion Dreyer, Bushman's Hole was irresistible. Dion, from a town near Johannesburg, was an adventurer at heart. He shot his first buck at 10, raced cars at 17, played with motorcycles, and designed loud car stereos. Diving was another of his passions. He couldn't sit still, never ever ever, said his younger brother, Werner. He said if he had a choice of how to go out in life, he'd like to go out diving, recalls his father, Theo. However, Dion's mother, Marie, begged him not to go. In 1993, Bushman's Hole had already taken the life of a diver named Eben Laden. He blacked out at around 200 feet. A dive buddy rushed him to the surface, but Laden didn't survive. And then on December the 17th, 1994, the hole claimed the life of Dion Dreyer. For Mother Marie and Father Theo, the nightmare started with a policeman's knock at the door. They then rushed to Mount Carmel, where slowly the story came out. The team had been doing a practice dive, and on the way back up at 196 feet, Dion seemed to be doing fine. He even gave the OK signal to his buddy using his hands, and so the group continued ascending. But at 164 feet, they noticed a light below them. A quick and confused diver count came up one head short. Team leader Dietlov Giliomi wasn't sure what was happening. He desperately started swimming down, but then was forced to stop when he realized the light below him was already more than 100 feet deeper and fading fast. I decided it was a suicide chase, he wrote in the accident report. No one knows for sure what killed Dion. The best guess is deep water blackout from carbon dioxide buildup. 2 weeks after the accident, his father Theo paid to bring in a small remotely operated sub. It found Dion's dive helmet on the floor of Bushman's Hole, but there was no sign of his body. Having realized that Dion would probably stay in that hole forever, Theo and Marie put a commemorative plaque on a rock wall above the entry pool. He had the most majestic grave in the country, and I said this will be his final resting place. Those are the words of Father Theo. 10 years later, in October of 2004, Dave Shaw called Theo Dreyer. I will go and fetch your son, he said. Theo immediately responded, yes, absolutely yes. More than anything, in that moment, he realized he wanted to see his son again, to have him back. And Dave was a man of his word. And so the time came for Dave to retrieve Dion. 10 minutes into his dive, Dave Shaw started to look for the bottom of Bushman's Hole. Complete blackness pressed in on him from all sides, and he directed his light downwards, hoping for a flash of rock or mud, but visibility was poor. Shaw was in an alien world. More than 800 feet below the surface pool that marks the entrance into the hole, he wore his black, crushed neoprene dry suit. On his back, he carried a closed-circuit rebreather set, which, unlike traditional open-circuit scuba gear, this recycled the gas that Shaw breathed, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide that he exhaled and adding oxygen back in. He carried 6 cylinders of gas with him. On the surface world, Shaw would barely have been able to move. But in the water, descending the shot line guiding him from the cave's entrance all the way down to the bottom, he was essentially weightless. At that moment, Dave Shaw was a very happy man. He touched down on the cave's sloping bottom, clipped off of the rope and started swimming. There really was no time to waste on this mission. Every minute he spent on the bottom would add more than an hour of decompression time on the way up. Remember, you do the depth, you do the time. But still, Shaw felt quite relaxed, enjoying that he was the first human to ever lay line at this depth, and then suddenly he stopped. About 50 feet to his left, perfectly illuminated in the water, was a human body. It was on its back, the arms reaching towards the surface. Shaw knew immediately who it was. Dion Dreyer. Shaw turned immediately, unspooling cave line as he went. Up close, he could see that Dion's tanks and dive harness, still in situ around his black and tan wetsuit, was all intact. Dion's head and hands, exposed to the water for all this time, were now unfortunately totally skeletonized. But his mask still sat in place on his skull. Thinking he should try to bring Dion back to the surface, Shaw wrapped his arms around the body and tried to lift. But Dion wouldn't move. His air tanks and the battery pack for his light appeared to be stuck in the mud underneath him, and Shaw was starting to pant from the struggle. This isn't wise, he said to himself. He was at 270 meters and working way too hard for a human that far down. He was already a minute over his planned bottom time, so Shaw quickly tied the cave reel to Dion's tanks. This was so the body could easily be found again. He then returned to the shot line to start his ascent. Approaching 400 feet, almost an hour into the dive, Shaw met up with his close friend, Don Shirley. Don was a 48-year-old British expat. He ran a technical diving school in Badplass, South Africa. After Don checked that Dave was okay, and also retrieved some of the spare gas cylinders hanging on a shot line below, Shaw showed him an underwater slate on which he had written 270 meters, found the body. Don's eyebrows shot up inside his mask. He reached out to shake his friend's hand. Don Shirley then left Dave Shaw, who had another 8 hours and 40 minutes of decompression to complete. As Shirley ascended, he realised that Dave would not be able to resist coming back to try to recover Dion one more time. He was so close to succeeding, he couldn't leave it like this. Don himself would be okay with leaving the body where it was, but Dave was a man who dived to pass the limits of what people thought was possible. In this dive alone, he had just hit a record depth on a rebreather, and now he had the opportunity to return a boy to his parents and, in the process, do something equally as stunning, make the deepest body recovery in the world. So he returned to the surface, regrouped and planned his second attempt. Dave Shaw arrived in Johannesburg 6 days before his second dive. His first destination was Kamati Springs. There he practiced placing a body into a bag underwater. In this instance, Don Shirley acted as Dion. The trial took place at a depth of 66 feet. Everything went smoothly, taking Shaw just a few minutes. And so the following day, Dave and Don drove to Mount Carmel. There they were joined by 7 South African rebreather divers hand-picked by Shirley, as well as by a police team from Cape Town and Pretoria, as a deceased body was obviously involved. The dive was scheduled for Saturday, January the 8th. Don had orchestrated a well-detailed dive plan. Dave Shaw's dive was expected to last around 12 hours, starting at 6 a.m. The other divers' schedules were coordinated with Dave's, each targeting specific depths to either help Dave or to help bring Dion's body to the surface. The first person Shaw would see on his ascent was Shirley at 725 feet. That is where Dave would hand over the body bag. Ideally, Dion's body would be out of the water about 80 minutes after Shaw began his dive. To minimise risks, Shirley planned 35 backup gas cylinders to be available. This would make sure there'd be more than enough supply to handle any rebreather failures. He also organised a rope and sling system provided by the police. A specialist in diving physiology was also hired to handle any medical emergencies. But despite all the risks, Dave was still quietly confident. He was careful to tell reporters and the team that the effort was an attempted recovery. The safety of the living would be put first. He also admitted that part of the motivation was the thrill of the adventure, even as some of the team members praised the efforts as a noble endeavour for the Dreyer family. There was one technical issue that Dave needed to address. This was the addition of an underwater camera housing. The camera placed on a climbing helmet was not Shaw's usual gear. He usually used a high-intensity light on his hand. This was something he could normally sling around his neck when necessary. So this helmet camera posed a new challenge, but after testing it in a pool and on a 500-foot dive, Dave was satisfied with the new setup. The night before the dive arrived. Everyone taking part gathered for a final briefing. Dave Shaw emphasized how important personal safety is over the mission. He urged each diver to prioritize their own well-being. He also had a private conversation with Don Shirley. He had upgraded his rebreather with an oil-filled controller to potentially reach the bottom of Bushman's hole. Dave told Don to assist only if signaled, and the two of them left the team with one last message. If either of them did not survive the dive, they did not want to be recovered. At 4 a.m. on Saturday, January the 8th, Dave Shaw and Don Shirley woke in the dark to prepare for their dive. Don had had a difficult night. Preparing the night before, a wire snapped as he was changing the battery on his new controller. This meant that he now couldn't dive, something which devastated him. But still, Dave was ready to go it alone. By 9 p.m. that night, he went to bed. In the meantime, with the help of the controller company, a soldering iron and some tinfoil, they miraculously managed to fix Shirley's controller. So this meant that Don could now once more join Dave on the dive. The team was back together. In the grey pre-dawn light, Shaw and Shirley drove to the hole, listening to music to relax. Given the potential length of the time underwater, Shirley included an adult diaper. The rest of the team, support divers, police divers and paramedics all assembled, and the area around the surface pool became crowded with dive equipment. Werner van Schaik, a 35-year-old South African, who set the women's depth record at a staggering 725 feet at Bushman's hole in October, set up tables and equipment around the hole. Shirley had asked her to act as surface marshal. At 6:13 a.m., with a video camera quietly whirring on his head, Dave Shaw took Don's hand and said, "I'll see you in 20 minutes. And so he disappeared into the dark waters of Bushman's hole. A few minutes later, Theo and Marie Dreyer arrived at the water's edge. They had arrived a little later to avoid putting any extra pressure on Dave Shaw. Dave descended quickly, letting the shot line slip through his fingers as he went. He reached the bottom of the hole in 11 minutes, even faster than planned. He immediately swam along the cave line. Upon seeing the remains once more, he pulled out the body bag. He then knelt alongside Dion and started to get to work. At this time, it was likely that Dave felt the narcosis, feeling as though he had drunk 4 or 5 strong drinks. He had now been at the bottom of Bushman's hole at 886 feet for just over 1 minute. 13 minutes after Shaw dove, Don Shirley got the go signal from Van Schaik. He then descended to his meeting point with Shaw at 725 feet. Approaching 500 feet, Don saw Dave's light about 400 feet below him, near the shot line. But the light wasn't moving. Don knew instantly that something had gone wrong. Dave was with Dion's body. His mission seemed to be going well, and he was about to bring the 20-year-old home to his parents. However, struggling to retrieve him for 6 minutes, he reached the time limit he had stated on his mission plan. He now had to return to the surface. However, he got tangled with the rope attached to Dion. This was the very line that Dave himself had placed to help find Dion. All of the equipment needed for the dive, mixed with an enclosed space and ropes, really was a recipe for disaster. A momentary lapse in his calm demeanor, along with the physical exertion, caused Dave's breathing to become more rapid. This led to the CO2 in his body to rise to dangerous levels. On the surface world, it would be something akin to hyperventilation, but to the point where consciousness was lost. And when that happens at such a depth and such a pressure, it is a very, very bad thing. By this time, over 20 minutes into the dive, Dave should have been ascending. However, only bubbles from venting gases in his rebreather and dry suit were visible. But there was no movement, only that one single still light. Don remained calm. He knew that emotion and panic had no place in these dark depths. And though Dave hadn't signaled for help, Don decided to go to the bottom. A motionless diver at 886 feet was not a good sign, but Shirley had to see if he could help him. "Okay, here we go then," he said to himself. At about 800 feet, deeper than he had ever been, Shirley heard a large crack and then a thud. The controller on his left forearm had been crushed. Without it, he would now have to manually monitor and inject oxygen into his rebreather. This was a full-time task, an emergency routine at a life-threatening depth. Don now realized that if he went down to try and help Dave, he would surely join him in eternity. So instead, he decided to ascend. Don regained control of his rebreather and started up the shot line, flipping through alternate decompression profiles on his slates. He faced at least another 10 agonizing hours in the water, knowing his friend was lost below him. After just a few minutes, Dave's light was swallowed up by the darkness below. A heroic attempt to bring a young man home to his family had actually left another family one member short. One more diver claimed by Bushman's hole. 3 days later, both Dave and Dion, still attached to the line, were raised to the surface. Their equipment was retrieved, including Dave's headcam, the footage of which you have been watching in this video. 51-year-old Dave Shaw and the remains of 20-year-old Dion Dreyer were finally retrieved. Dave's post-mortem confirmed that an excessive buildup of carbon dioxide caused his demise. He stopped breathing just 22 minutes into the dive. On April 5th, 1988, the sun was shining in North Carolina over the Franklin County Parachute Center. Ivan McGuire arrived at the center early. He was feeling excited and ready for a day of supervising nervous student skydivers. Some of them would be jumping for the very first time. Ivan had been skydiving a long time, and although he was only 35, he was now considered a veteran. He was a familiar face at the center too, the place where Ivan was planning to transition into the next phase of his dream career. That was becoming a skydiver photographer. And although Ivan had completed more than 800 jumps, he still remembered the feeling of his first skydive all too well. Seeing the blueness of the sky so closely, being amongst the icy cold clouds, looking down on thousands of people living their lives, gaining a new sobering perspective on existence. The almost overwhelming nerves of stepping out of a small plane, hearing only the buzzing roar of the engine and the almost deafening blast of the wind as the door opened, inching to the open door, hanging your legs over the edge, and then in a moment that denies all logic from your normal life, you jump. That first moment of freefall, the sickening acceleration as you reach terminal velocity, and then the bizarre feeling of suspension, almost separated from time and space, strangely relaxing as it is exhilarating, before being yanked back to reality after pulling the cord of the parachute, as the fast rippling of taut fabric instantly slows your fall to earth, and then things become more calm, the gentle float mixed with G-force, before your feet make contact with solid ground once more, returning to earth as the adrenaline slowly works through your system. Ivan was excited to share this feeling with his students. For many people, it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and that's why he liked to capture it on photos and video. Ivan checked in at the center and greeted his first student of the day. Another instructor was with them too, and together the three of them pulled on coveralls before heading out to the airfield. Even though it was only April, the ground beneath them was already dry and was starting to be scorched by the sun that would intensify as the weather transitioned to summer. Ivan put on the bulky camera equipment that was spread between handheld elements, as well as a large pack that would be worn on the torso. And so he got to work. The plane Ivan and the jumpers got into was tiny. They were elbow to elbow as they sat together for takeoff. Ivan looked over at the student who was shaking. "Don't worry," Ivan comforted them, his voice barely audible against the noise of the engine. "When you're out there, you'll forget all about this part. You'll just remember feeling weightless, gliding. There's nothing like it. Even 800 jumps later, I still love it." The student nodded, slightly assured. The plane had climbed, circling its way high into the sky. It was now time to jump. They all stood stooped together in the small door of the plane, looking out at the clear sky that surrounded them. The instructor and Ivan looked at the student. "Let's go through this one more time." And the student looked grateful. "Ripcord here." The instructor pointed to it. "We'll pull this just after you jump. And if you get stuck, then remember I'm right with you and can open it for you. So don't panic." Ivan agreed and smiled reassuringly. "The parachute will bring you gently down to earth, but remember to bend your knees as you get closer. First few seconds are scary, but after that, you won't ever want to land." The student nodded again. Ivan climbed to the outside of the plane, hanging on tightly until the student was about to jump. "Ready?" the instructor asked, which was Ivan's cue to let go, quickly hurtling towards the ground, away from the plane. And then, after some deep breaths from the student, they jumped too. The jump was captured by Ivan on camera from below, an incredible moment immortalized on video for the student. As he sailed through the sky, Ivan smiled. It really never did get old. As soon as they landed, Ivan had to head almost immediately back up into the air, but this time with a different student. He repeated his advice. He squeezed their hand as it started to shake, and again he recorded their flight back down to Earth, knowing he was capturing something that would never be forgotten by his students. He felt exhilarated that his career was taking him in this dream direction. But this job used a lot of adrenaline, and it required a lot of mental focus. So understandably, Ivan was getting tired by the time he got to his third student. Ivan had 2 successful jumps that morning, capturing the students' jumps in glorious VHS, and then he prepared for the third. The magic of jumping hadn't worn off yet, but he could tell his energy was lower. Despite all of his experience, his body still always had the same adrenaline rush whenever he'd start free-falling. Still, as he ascended once more into the sky for the third time, he gazed over the clouds. Just as he had with the other students, he felt the same resurgence of gratefulness he often got in these quiet moments, that his days could be spent seeing the earth from another angle. He couldn't believe he'd already done 800 jumps by now, and he was excited for another 800 more to come, and to see the other people he could meet along the way. He thought of all the photos he'd taken that were likely lining people's mantelpieces, of the videos played on TVs in living rooms with families huddled round, of the way he'd managed to capture those perfect moments as people plummeted. He turned to the student, encouraging them through the process as he had with the others that day. Ivan wanted every student to feel that they were special, whether they were the first, second, third, or beyond. The instructor checked the students' straps and then asked them, "Ready?" The student looked at the instructor and then at Ivan. The 3 of them crouched in the plane. The door slid open and the wind howled through their ears. "It'll be okay," Ivan mouthed. The student smiled hesitantly. "I'll be right there with you," the instructor promised. "Me too," Ivan added. "Nothing can go wrong. We've both done this so many times. I know it's difficult, but if you can, focus on enjoying the moment." The student nodded and breathed deeply. "Okay," they smiled. "I'll try." The instructor and the student stood at the edge of the plane, looking over the open sky spreading out before them, the ground thousands of feet below. "Ready?" the instructor asked, and then both the student and Ivan gave a thumbs up. Ivan could tell the student was still tentative, but he hoped that as soon as they felt that reassuring tug of the parachute catching the air, breaking their fall and bringing them safety, they'd be able to relax a little more. Ivan once more exited the plane but hung on to the outside. He was waiting for his signal to jump to capture one more person's dream being realized. And then Ivan jumped, quickly followed by the student and the professional. The extreme sports cameraman felt the heaviness of his rucksack on his back. Carrying the weight from his parachute and camera equipment felt normal after all these jumps. Ivan had the camera rolling before he'd even left the plane, recording the entire thing. Muscle memory kicked in and he focused on the student as much as possible. the blast of air resistance loudly wrapping around him. It acted as a reminder that he would soon have to pull his own ripcord. After just 5 seconds, Ivan hit terminal velocity, a pretty horrifying speed of 120 miles an hour. The ground was approaching fast. Ivan watched from below as the students and the instructor pulled their ripcord. They slowed suddenly and would now begin their safe gliding descent down to the ground. This was Ivan's cue to deploy his parachute to slow his downwards journey too. Doing this would mean he could get closer to the tandem jumper to get more good footage, before then eventually landing and meeting up to debrief on this bucket list experience. So, Ivan reached for his ripcord, positioned on the front of the shoulder strap of his pack, and this would release his chute. He didn't initially feel what he was looking for, but it was possible for it to be blown flat against his torso, or perhaps it had slipped from its pocket. However, neither of these things were the case. Ivan quickly realized that the ripcord wasn't there at all. As he reached behind him to his backpack for his chute, his hand only fumbled against the hardness of his camera equipment. That wasn't his parachute. He grasped to his right instead. Perhaps it had gotten slightly twisted and caught up. The air was still screeching around him. Reaching to his left, not there. Still, he could only feel the bulk of his camera equipment. He checked the right again, and that's when Ivan realized a nightmare had become his reality. He never put his parachute on again after the second jump. The weight of the parachute that he thought he felt wasn't his parachute at all. It was his camera gear, and camera gear only. "Oh my God, no," he screamed, but only the air and his camera could hear him. He knew at the speed he was traveling, he'd only have about another 60 seconds until he reached the ground. Try to imagine for a moment being 35 years old, knowing you had just 1 minute of life remaining. Ivan realized the film that he was taking for the student would instead show his own final moments. We can see the moment of panic when Ivan reaches to grab his pack, and then realize this is it. All his hopes, dreams, plans for the future, all of them snuffed out before he even hit the ground. But was there anything he could do to save himself, or did he just have to wait for the inevitable? The earth was drawing into sharper focus. Ivan could see the buildings of the airfield where only that morning he'd arrived, with no idea what was to come later that day. This was to be his final view. He went to check one more time if he'd bought his parachute. Surely this could not be his reality, but still, nothing. How could he have done this after all these years, after all these jumps? Ivan's breath grew heavier and sharper, naturally tensing, preparing to protect itself from the imminent danger. And then, after what must have felt like hours, not minutes, the grim inevitability happened. The impact into solid ground measured over 100 miles per hour, and then there was silence. When the student landed with their instructor, they looked over to find Ivan. "I did it," the student beamed, still shaky from the adrenaline. They couldn't wait to thank Ivan for helping them trust themselves, taking that first step into the nothingness of the sky. But where was he? They couldn't see Ivan anywhere. At one point, he'd been right next to them in the sky. The student wondered if perhaps they'd been mistaken, if actually Ivan didn't jump with them too. That moment before they leapt from the plane was hectic, so maybe he was just mistaken. They looked to their instructor, but he looked equally confused, and together they looked up at the sky, as if the sky itself could provide answers to their questions. But nothing. Nor could they see the brightness of Ivan's parachute canopy anywhere near them. The instructor was used to Ivan landing close by. This was so he could continue to film the relief of the student's face as they felt the ground beneath their feet. Later they could replay it, and it might even give them the confidence to jump again. And then someone from the flying school started running towards them. A cold realization dawned over the pair. Something must have happened to Ivan. The person was screaming, over 1.5 miles away from the airfield. the place where this adventure had just started. Ivan's body had now been found. Ivan's demise didn't seem to make sense. He'd done so many jumps that he was considered a pro. How could he have forgotten something as fundamental as his parachute? The wife of the parachute center owner, Nancy Fayard, said in an interview, no one was aware that he got into the plane without a parachute. Of course, no one knew, or they would have stopped him. An investigation was launched by the Federal Aviation Administration into the accident to try and find answers. Ivan doing this on purpose was almost immediately ruled out. Everyone who was close to Ivan knew it was something that he'd never even consider. After all, he'd been so excited at the prospect of launching the next phase of his career as a skydiving photographer. One of the inspectors from the administration, Walter Rigsby, questioned the plane's pilot, Mark Luhman. Mark had flown Ivan that day, and under the Federal Aviation Regulations, one of the clauses, 105, states that the pilot must check that any parachutist has all of their equipment before they jump. So, had Mark checked Ivan? They soon realised, however, that Ivan's camera equipment and bag that he placed it in looked pretty much exactly the same as the one that he took his parachute in. And Ivan was so experienced after all. With the bag on his back, everyone, including the pilot, had assumed that it must have just been his parachute. It seemed that no matter how many jumps Ivan had completed, he hadn't been able to overcome a trait that all humans can succumb to: simply being tired.